Welcome to Fast Fuel, your bite-sized sports nutrition podcast designed to help you get the latest science, news and insights from the world of performance nutrition in 20 minutes or less, brought to you by Get Pro Professional. I'm your host, James Morehen, and I have over 10 years experience working in professional and elite sport, from sports like rugby, football and boxing, but also endurance athletes. Each episode, we will be joined by a special guest working at the forefront of elite sport or academia to get their nuggets of knowledge on their own specialist area of sports or sports nutrition. From learning how to fuel and support teams through major tournaments, to starting out as a new sports nutritionist and hearing the latest on protein science and research, we have you covered here on Fast Fuel. So sit back, relax and get ready to learn from the best of the best in the world of sports nutrition. Welcome to Fast Fuel. Let's go. Today we're joined again by Olly Witard, reader in Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism at King's College London, to talk about nutrition for the master athlete. For those that didn't join us on the previous episode, can you just give a little insight into who you are and what your current roles are?
Yep, my name's Oliver Witard. I'm a reader in Exercise Metabolism and Nutrition at King's College London. So I'm in an academic setting. So I combine teaching with research within my job description. So teaching students around sports nutrition, but also conducting research on protein nutrition for athletes and exercisers, including older adult populations as well.
Amazing. So on the previous episode, we asked you about your favourite meal, your childhood dream. But in this episode, I'm keen to know, what is your favourite athlete and or team of all time?
Crikey, that's a tough one. It would have to be Ryan Giggs and Manchester United would be the answer.
Nice. Team you follow?
Manchester United.
Yeah, okay. And why does that come to mind straight away?
Yeah, as a child, that was what I loved, who I loved to watch, and I was Manchester United through and through. That was part of my blood, I suppose. And
did you try and emulate the top off and swinging over the head?
I didn't. I was left-footed as a footballer. I still am left-footed. So I had a lot of the same characteristics as my hero, Ryan Giggs.
Nice. So today's episode is all about the Masters athlete, Olly, and in particular, what would you say is the top nutritional protein advice for the Masters athlete?
So based on research, studies that in comparing young and older adults, I think it's become more and more clear that as we age, we require a higher dose of protein to maximally stimulate the muscle anabolic response. And this is essentially down to this concept that we call anabolic resistance. And what that means is that as we age, our muscles become less responsive to the key anabolic stimuli, namely protein feeding and exercise. So as a result, in order to get the same anabolic response to a protein feed, the studies have generally suggested that we need higher doses of protein to maximize that response.
And just for clarity for everyone listening, the definition of a Masters athlete is what?
Good point. So in terms of a research and academic setting, we talk about older adults or a master athlete as being someone 65 years and above. That's how we would classify this population. However, from a sports nutrition perspective or a sporting scenario, the master athlete can be as young as 35 years, depending upon when that sport is at the end of their sport. A typical professional is no longer a professional. But it could be 45 years plus. It just depends upon the sport of interest. But from a research perspective, when we talk about older adults, the studies are generally looking at 65 years plus. What is interesting though is that from an older adult perspective, from a Masters athlete's perspective, one 65-year-old is very different to another 65-year-old. So it would be very helpful if we start being even more tight with our definition of what is a master athlete.
Yeah, straight away there I'm thinking a retired rugby player, as an example, the sport I work in at 35, great career, 35 for the rugby player. then they're technically a master athlete because they've retired, all the way up to what age would that be before they then become what is there a level above a master's athlete that the research and evidence would then change again?
It's an interesting question, because when we talk about where I'm very much interested in is around muscle and how muscle changes with advancing age. And actually, and I kind of touched on it, this concept of anabolic resistance, this phenomenon starts within essentially middle age, i.e. in the 5th or 6th decade of life, so in your 50s, for example, or even 40s. It occurs much earlier than perhaps what often is appreciated. So from a, I suppose, healthy aging perspective, not necessarily a master athlete scenario, but a healthy aging perspective, then the changes that we see in physiology are actually starting much earlier than we perhaps often appreciate. So the long and the short, or the point is that in terms of intervening, then the idea is we need to intervene earlier, i.e. within middle age, to be able to see these effects in older age. So if you apply that to a master athlete scenario, of course, master athletes by definition are exercising, they're training, they're in a different scenario than, say, just your average older adult. So it is all context specific in that sense. I think one of the points we talk about a lot is chronological aging and biological aging. And we make a big point around it's much more important to talk about biological aging. And that biological aging is underpinned by your training status. So yes, we are all going to chronologically age, but that doesn't need to be the determining factor as to how we age from a biological perspective. And master athletes are a perfect model for that, because master athletes by definition have trained their whole lives. That's the key definition of a master athlete. You have to have trained your whole life. So you haven't been sedentary and then you've just started embarked on a training program, say in later life for the first time. You've always trained. And what the studies show is that from a muscle perspective is that whilst you can't prevent the loss of muscle mass with advancing age.
So just for clarity, the body's ability to grow and build skeletal muscle tissue happens naturally as we get older. But at what point does that stop? And then how does that then affect or develop what happens later on if we don't train and we don't become or continue to become the master athlete?
Great question, and earlier than perhaps we appreciated. So this idea of the anabolic resistance actually can start within, say, even the 5th or 6th decade of life. So in our 40s or 50s, so in a middle-aged period of our life. So actually, this, from a metabolic standpoint, this loss of muscle mass actually begins much earlier than we originally thought. So from an intervention perspective, then there's much more emphasis should be placed on actually intervening earlier on to ensure that we don't lose this muscle mass to critical levels in our older adult years. And I guess that's where it comes in with this idea of chronological aging and biological aging. We're all going to age chronologically, that's inevitable. But from a biological standpoint, we can mitigate this loss of, in our example, of muscle mass with advancing age through ensuring that we continue lifestyle activities such as physical activity throughout the lifespan. And I guess that's another way we can define a master athlete. A master athlete is someone that has trained their whole lives. They haven't just started training within their older adult period of their life. They've trained the whole period of their life. And if you compare a master athlete with a general population, older adult who hasn't trained in the early years, then you can see this retention of muscle mass with the master athletes, so that their muscle essentially responds a bit more like a young muscle. Essentially, they're able to keep the youthful response to these different anabolic stimuli, even with advancing chronological aging. They're able to mount this anabolic response.
And then in terms of we touched on a little bit here about skeletal muscle mass, and inherently there'll be a link there into protein. what would your protein requirements and needs be for that master athlete? Is it above and beyond what some of us would normally do with the adolescent youth athletes that we're working with at club level? Should it be a lot higher now for that master athlete?
Yeah, when we've done some studies where we've compared the dose-response relationship of protein dose and muscle protein synthesis response in young, and we've compared that relationship in older adults. And in the young adults, we saw that break point, the plateau at a 0.3 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per serving. That was in the young adults. When we did exactly the same in the older adults, we did the same analysis, statistical analysis, or it was called breakpoint analysis. So it's called a regression analysis. We showed that it was higher. That breakpoint was at 0.4 grams per kilogram body mass per serving. So I take the point that even in the young, if we look at foods, that might be higher. If we look at certain scenarios in athletic populations, such as a weight loss scenario, we may go up higher to 0.4. But nonetheless, in older adults, it was higher compared to the young adults. And that comes back to this idea of anabolic resistance, in that to mount the same response of the muscle, anabolic response to that protein, you need more of it in an older adult compared to a younger adult. But then from a more holistic perspective, if we're talking about healthy aging per se, then one of the things you want to do with an older adult is make sure they eat enough. And as older people get advanced with age, one of the things that happens is their appetite is reduced. And which of those macronutrients is the most satiating of all macronutrients is protein. So you've got this paradox, essentially. You're recommending these higher protein intakes to maximize the muscle growth response with older adults. However, you're also very keen not to suppress appetite because of the impact that could have in terms of, healthy aging. So it's a real balancing act between making that recommendation on an acute perspective, but also having a holistic approach in terms of ensuring that they're still consuming sufficient amount of energy over the course of the day.
And so with that optimal dosage of 0.4 gram per kilo, would the total amount over the course of that 24-hour window should it be elevated as well in the aging population?
So I would argue that comparison's dependent upon the control, i.e. whether you're talking about the general young adult population or some with elevated needs, such as a resistance trained athlete or an endurance trained athlete. So over the course of the day, I wouldn't say you do need more, because in a trained athlete, you've probably got more eating occasions. You've probably not just thinking about your 3 square meals of the day, you're thinking about your snacks, your even a bedtime feed in a given sports nutrition recommendations. Whereas if we take an older adult from a more clinical perspective, then you're probably focusing more on those meals of the day, i.e. 3 meals of the day. So I guess the difference between the two is that you're talking about 3 eating occasions in an older adult, as opposed to in a sports nutrition scenario, more eating occasions to maximize that adaptive response. Is
there much research on the specific nutritional needs of that master athlete outside of protein? Obviously, we've articulated there the importance of protein, but what about carbohydrates and fat in that aging population as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, with protein, it lends itself to looking at the muscle response. But beyond that, with aging, we've also got changes in immune function that we see with aging. And of course, that lends itself to many different aspects of sports nutrition and clinical nutrition, whether that be through carbohydrate, which we know is a key substrate for immune cells, in particular, lymphocytes, for example. We've got other strategies that we can put in place, and we talk about this immune resistance and immune tolerance, these nutritional interventions to try and improve those outcomes. Again, they are, if anything, increased with advancing age. Again, with aging, we've also got other aspects of health, brain health, for example, where we know that nutrition can have a role in that regard. We've done some work in omega-3s in the context of muscle, but there's a lot of work looking at the omega-3s in the context of brain health, particularly one of the omega-3 species, DHA, which is incorporated into the brain neuron. So as a result, there's been a lot of interest in the role of DHA in the context of brain health in older adult populations.
Just bringing it back to the master athlete, if there was one master athlete, either present or not, that you could work with, who would that be and why?
That would be a tough one. I would probably, the first name that springs to mind would be Steve Redgrave, because of course he had so many different challenges throughout his career with being able to, incredible pedigree in terms of staying at the top for so long, but all the other health challenges that he had with in terms of the diabetes that he had in that regard. So it'd probably be Steve Redgrave.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Steve. I remember meeting Steve in person at a snowboarding event in London, and the size of the bloke, the size of his hands, but also just the size of his kind of chest cavity and almost like his lungs and diaphragm was just insane. And then I can't remember, what his VO2 max was when he was in his prime, but it was one of the best. But yeah, an unbelievable athlete. In terms of micronutrients, we've touched on a little bit there. In particular the omega and the DHA. Are there any other key micronutrients outside of the traditional macros that, if it was Ollie in 20 years time, 30 years time, you would be really dialing in on, and what would they be and why?
So I think vitamin D springs to mind in terms of musculoskeletal health, particularly in aging populations. And I think there's more and more evidence that there's a link between, particularly in countries such as ourselves, where we don't have that sunlight exposure, particularly if you allow for baseline vitamin D status or 25 OHD status. So I've been fortunate enough to work in a ballet scenario where so elite ballet dancers, they, of course, most of their training is inside. They don't have that access to the sunlight. So I think there's lots of application in that regard. I think that there's also work in calcium supplementation as well. I think one example is in intense environments, hot environments, we get these dermal losses of calcium, which I think is underappreciated by many athletes, particularly those with high sweat rates. And I think that there's more and more evidence that calcium supplementation in that sense can be helpful. And then, of course, we've got a lot of interest in, REDs and low energy availability athletes, particularly endurance-based athletes, particularly female athletes, but not necessarily only female athletes, but, and of course, iron supplementation in that regard could be an important aspect.
And is it enough then to consume the oily-based fish 2-3 times a week? Or actually, do you think, no, the aging population, they really need to supplement?
Good question. And I think it comes down to individual scenarios. Of course, fish is expensive. So we can't get away from that. There's pragmatic reasons for whether you would choose to try and have a food first approach in that sense or look at supplements. I think that probably supplementation is a good way to go for that reason. It can be much more regulated throughout the course of the year, and you can just stick to your routine. And older people like a routine, and if they can have those supplements in capsule format, for example, or even in drink format, then I think that's a good way. I'm not necessarily advocating supplements all the way, but I think omega-3s do fit into that category.
Ollie's, for master athletes or practitioners that are working with master athletes, what would be your top 3 non-negotiables, or these are must things that you need to do from a nutrition point of view?
So the first would be aiming for a protein dose of 0.4 grams per kilogram body mass per serving in order to maximize the anabolic response to that protein feed. The second would be to ensure that the older adult is consuming sufficient omega-3s. From a muscle perspective, in particular, EPA-rich omega-3, but from a brain perspective, sufficient DHA. That's the key omega-3 species. And then I guess the third isn't nutrition related, but it's to exercise, to remain physically active, to exercise. And I think the additional point there is to minimize periods of sedentary behavior within the course of the day. And just a final point is it's never too late to start exercise and training.
Yeah, superb. I think I will phone my mum after today and get her to increase her protein content and to start consuming the omega-3s. So thank you for that. Olly, today's been an absolute masterclass for the Master Athlete, and just a massive thank you from myself, and really enjoyed that episode. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James.